Fred Bone grew up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Fred's father was a two-term legislator and mother was in education. During summers, Fred was working on a farm while the rest of the kids were at summer camps. He went to college at NC State for his bachelor's in chemistry as he was very much interested in science. Due to his father's strong political career, Fred got inspired to work for the DOT as a house page and for the Sergeant-at-Arms staff until the age of 20. After graduating from college, Fred worked for Department of Environment for 12 years based on his chemistry background. Now, what triggered Fred into the world of lobbying from that point? What myth Fred would like to bust about lobbying? What little secret Fred has which very few of us know about him? Let's tune in to Fred's experiences and wisdom in this next episode of State Lobbying Heroes podcast. Hey Fred, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Let's jump into it. Let's start off with the rapid fire of questions. The first question I have for you is, what is the one myth or misconception about lobbying?
I think the one myth or misconception that we would have about lobbying would definitely be that we all carry a pitchfork and have a long pointy tail. We are not the devil incarnate. That is the perception that a lot of people have. They're those evil lobbyists. The only thing that rates below a lobbyist might be a legislator. And it's a debate on who's on the bottom. The lawyers have us beat by a long shot in popularity. So yeah, I'd say the myth is that we are all evil there to get money and to take advantage of people, but that is not the reality of the situation.
Okay. What would you be if you weren't a lobbyist?
I would probably still be a chemist. I was in the chemistry field. I'm an analytical chemist by training and would probably still be in a laboratory somewhere. But as fate would have it, I had the opportunity to get into government affairs and it has been a really nice fit.
Excellent. What are the three skills you think are essential for someone to be a good lobbyist?
Patience and knowing the people and knowing the process. Knowledge, I guess, would be one of the skills you're saying, but lobbying is all about the people in the process. You have to understand that people are willing to work with you and that you have to understand the full process of how a bill becomes a law. And a lot of times you have to educate even legislators on that particular process. So I would tell you that you have to be kind of a people person. You don't necessarily have to be an extrovert. I know plenty of introverts that are, but it does help because you've got to be able to work with all kinds of different people and you've got to get knowledge of your subject matter. So those would be the skills I would tell you would need.
Excellent. What is your favorite book or hobby?
Book or hobby? Well, I would probably begin with the book and tell you that's probably the Bible. Being a Christian in today's environment is difficult, but that has always been my favorite book. Probably my favorite hobby is fishing. I have a friend that introduced me into king mackerel fishing a few years ago. I refer to him as my expensive friend because after going with him once, I had to buy a boat, new rods, new reels. So I do enjoy fishing on the coast and saltwater fishing as well.
Sweet. What inspires or motivates you to be doing what you're doing?
A lot of the inspiration comes from having confidence that our government does actually work. Although a lot of people think that our system is broken, I have confidence that if the procedures are followed and if you work hard, that the government will come to the right decision. We may have different views on how we arrive at that decision, but the overall government is best to reach conclusions that are best for a citizen. But how you get there is different, but you got to be inspired every day that the government process will work.
Well said. What is your favorite destination spot?
That would be Atlantic Beach, North Carolina. We've got a small place, a mobile home down there, and I spend a lot of time at the beach. So I do love the Atlantic Beach area because it has fishing very close in. It's got stores. It's got everything you need. So I enjoy right here in North Carolina on the coast.
Do you have any role models in your life?
My role model would have probably been my father, who passed away about 10 years ago. He's the reason I got into lobbying, and so I would have to probably say he was my role model.
What is the one thing you want to share which no one else knows about you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Hmm. I would probably share that, and I don't know that people don't know, I'm sort of an open book. But I would probably share that I do greatly enjoy working with kids and the Boy Scouts. And a lot of people wouldn't know that I'm assistant scoutmaster, particularly in the legislative world. But I've been working with the Boy Scouts for a number of years now. Though not a scout myself growing up, I've had the opportunity to work with the young people and help them to develop. And a lot of my scouts have reached Eagle Scout, and I'm most proud of them. So not a lot of people would recognize me as a scoutmaster, but I would probably say that.
Excellent. With that, let's jump into your past. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I'm one of those rare creatures in North Carolina that has been in North Carolina their whole life, where I'm not moved in from anywhere else. I'm an Eastern North Carolina boy. I grew up with a father who was active in politics and a mother who was in education. My dad never believed in summer camp. He believed in labor camp. Time I was 12 years old, when most of my friends would get to go to summer camp, I was working on the farm for my uncles out in Sandy Cross, North Carolina, which is about 15 minutes from Rocky Mount. I grew up priming tobacco, picking up cucumbers and potatoes and doing general farm work until I was about 18 years old when I got old enough to do something different when I went to work for the state DOT. And I had the opportunity to work in the summers for DOT when I was 18, 19, and 20, and then work for the Sergeant at Arms staff when I was in 1990. So that's sort of the history of how I grew up. But yeah, from Rocky Mount, North Carolina in the east, about an hour east of Raleigh.
Very nice. And how was your schooling like? I mean, were you actively involved in like any student body organizations or debates or anything like that?
Well, Rocky Mount Senior High was a very interesting place to grow up. It still is an interesting place. Body Knoll and Hardee's was a big king back in those days. Body Knoll owned the Hardee's franchise and it's expanded into Carl Jr.'s, et cetera. And so you had a lot of information from that. And so Rocky Mount Senior High was a very interesting school, and we had a very good marching band program that I was a part of. We won two national championships when I were there in the highest level of marching band. And people, that's one of those other things people don't know is, yeah, I marched in high school band, but it was more because it was a pleasure of my mother than it was a pleasure of me. She enjoyed band much more than I did. But I will say it paid off because when I went to North Carolina State, it enabled me to go to the All-American Bowl when Brett Favre was actually his senior year before he went to the pros. So I can actually say I saw Brett Favre play against State and State won.
That's nice. And any glimpses of you being interested in politics back then? Like was your father, sharing anything which you were like, particularly interested in?
Well, actually, Dad served from 79 to 81 and then he had some business struggles and he ended up becoming the right hand of Liston Ramsey, who was the speaker at that time. At that time, he was the longest serving House Speaker. So I grew up coming to Raleigh and being involved in politics. It was part of your life growing up. I mean, it was just always there. As many sons of political figures would tell you, yes, it took time away from the family, but it was important that my dad served. And so I grew up around it. I was a house page. I was up here an awful lot. Like I said, it was all part of the family fabric growing up. And so I grew up and it just was kind of always present. I always said I would try to stay away from it. And it, much like I said before, it's a black hole that kind of sucks you in. When you had the opportunity to come back, I did come back into it and I've greatly enjoyed it because I do enjoy the people. You'll never find a finer group than is around the legislature. But I will say that being around it my whole life was interesting. My dad's roommate, he had an apartment here in Raleigh during my college years, and that roommate was a fellow named Billy Watkins, who was one of the most powerful members. He was a senior chair of appropriations back in those days. And so I had many, many, many conversations with Representative Watkins that even legislators couldn't have because he would be candid around the apartment and sit around and talk to a college kid much more so than he would in public. And so I gained great insights from Representative Watkins and his tutelage at that time.
That's awesome.
That kind of answer your question?
Yes, you did.
All
And
right.
and after your high school, what made you pick Bachelors of Science in Chemistry at the North Carolina State University?
Well, if you grow up in my house, you would not have a choice but to be an NC State fan. There was NC State and a few other colleges around the North Carolina, but none of which were NC State. So it was a foregone conclusion that if I got into state, I was going to state. I don't even think I applied to other colleges. My mother was an East Carolina grad, but never was I encouraged to go to East Carolina. It was always, when are you going to state? And I will say that I'm not one of those 4.5 GPA kind of people. I worked hard through school and did well, but I was your solid B student. And coming from Nash County, when you applied to state, I actually applied under agronomy. I had all the agricultural background, that's agricultural business. And I spent 2 years at North Carolina State in the agronomy program, learning all about soil science, agricultural business. And I'm really glad I did, because how many cows do I need to make a farm work makes a lot more sense than how many widgets does a company need to produce in order to make a profit. So I was able to get through Econ of Ag a whole lot easier than I would have other economics courses at state. And then I made the transfer into the School of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, which is PAMS. Did well at chemistry. My mom was a chemistry teacher in high school. So what I did was I had a lot of friends who were political science majors, psychology and sociology, and I would have loved to have majored in any one of those because I excelled in them beyond. And I didn't have to put a whole lot of work into it. So I really would have loved to have majored in one of those, but I had to figure out, how can I make a living? And I knew that the chemistry fields at least provided jobs where I would be able to support a family later on. And so I focused, rather than doing things that I truly enjoyed, focused more on the more science side of it. And it did pay off. I did manage to minor in environmental science at state, which I greatly enjoyed. It helped me develop an environmental philosophy that I carry today. I was exposed to a lot of forestry classes in that particular course. And the forestry perspective, they believe in the 1972 Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. And with foresters, most of the time, if you talk to them, they're all about using the land and using what we have today so that we have things for our children and our generations to come back. Just like if you clear cut a forest, you go back and you plant the new trees so that the next generation will have a forest to enjoy as well. And that philosophy lines up with how I believe today, and is sometimes contrary to what we hear from environmentalists today that want to protect everything that we have without being able to use it. I'm a big use it and replant it and redo. So that's kind of where my environmental philosophies that carry forth even to today with the clients that I represent come from.
Excellent. And after your bachelor's degree, um, did you have any thoughts of getting a master's degree, or did you think like, no, I just want to get into the workforce?
I am one of those stories that, yes, I did apply to law school. Thought I might want to go into law at one time. That was a lot of the persuading of my father, but I did not get accepted at Campbell, and I did not get accepted the second time I applied at Campbell, even though I had some fantastic people write me recommendations. So after the second chance of not getting in, I decided it wasn't the Lord's will for me to do that and that I needed to be pursuing a different direction. And that's exactly what I did. Worked for a chemistry lab out in Research Triangle Park for a couple of years, learning analytical chemistry, running a gas spectrograph. Also did a lot of work on analytical chemistry. And so I had the opportunity to live with my father for 2 years after I graduated college. And these were the 2 years I was working in the park. But I was working in the park and I was working second shift. And Roger Bone did not understand that if you had a second shift job, you went to work at 3:30 and you worked till 11:30 at night. Well, when I was living with him, he thought, well, that's great. That means you get up at 6:30 and go to work for me at 8, and you work from 8 to 3:30 for me. And that's what I did to pay my rent. I worked for my dad at the General Assembly during that entire time. So yes, my dad only believed in he believed in a half day. 12 hours is half a day. So I only worked half days. I worked 12-hour days.
Wow.
And so I did that all the way through, and then I had the opportunity, but thanks to going to work with him, I met up with a fellow who was with the Department of Environment, and he told me that he had a job over at the state lab and he would love to interview me for. And I actually went to work for him, and then that's how I ended up at the state for 12 years.
Oh, wow. So at what point you said like you were also a page at the General Assembly? So when
I was
was
a
that?
page back about when I would have been about 12. And because my dad was there, I was always up there. There are stories that float around the legislature to this day. If you can find legislative assistants that served back in the 80s, there are the up until about 2 years ago when Doc Barber retired, there were stories about me changing their typewriter ribbons. All the legislative assistants would say I would go in and mess with their typewriter ribbons and mess up their margins, and so they hated to see me come because they knew I was going to mess something up. So that's true story up until about 2 years when Doc retired. I was still hearing that story. Some of the more senior LAs could probably tell you that story today.
That's very cool. So, like after you graduated and then you had this experience working for a Department of Environment, um, at what point, was the trigger that, okay, I want to try my experience or like my footing in lobbying? What was the trigger point?
Well, I enjoyed working for the state. I would never say anything bad about working for the state. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was given the opportunity to certify laboratories all over the United States. I had the western half of the country, so I had laboratories in California, in Oregon, in Washington State, in Texas, all over. And so I got to do a lot of traveling and see a lot of different things with that. But the one drawback is the state pay scale. They do not take real good care of their employees. You get great retirement, you get great benefits, but the pay rate was low. And so I came to a point where my dad was getting ready to hire somebody new. He approached me and said, I've had Elizabeth Dalton. She was Walter Dalton's daughter working for me for the last 2 or 3 years, and she's leaving to go take on a new opportunity. And so he said, would you like to come and take Elizabeth's job? And I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. I've tried to stay away from the legislative world, but let's give it a try. So I went to work with Dad then, and I worked for him 6 years before he passed away. And when he passed away 10 years ago, I've continued the business on, and thanks to good relationships with clients and good clients, I've been able to continue on and be a lobbyist for now on 16 years full time, but much longer than that if you count all the other stuff I've done.
Yeah, that's so cool. So can you tell us, like, of all the experience you've had at the Department of Environment for 12 years you've been there, I mean, what was the one skill you gained from it, which you probably are even utilizing till date?
I was given the most difficult laboratories to inspect because of the fact that I was able to use people skills, and that's the number one thing you have to have. You have to understand people. And a lot of what I did was go into very high tension, high conflict situations and try to resolve the situation. I got a lot of labs that were out of state, so they did not wish to do things the way that North Carolina wanted them done because in many cases they simply didn't have North Carolina samples coming in, but they were certified by North Carolina. And my job was to make sure that they were compliant with North Carolina law, but I had a way of going in and trying to make sure they were compliant and doing what they were supposed to while still maintaining their workflow. Finding ways that we could meet the obligations together without having to sacrifice what they needed to do to be able to be profitable, especially if they were not looking at North Carolina samples. You had a lot of places like in California that would want to have North Carolina certification because they might do military work, and we have a lot of military bases here. And so they would be certified in North Carolina on the hopes that Fort Bragg or Cherry Point may send them a sample for laboratory analysis. They really did very little work that was used in North Carolina. So what I would allow them to do is set up protocols that were specific to North Carolina. If they got a sample in and it was compliant with these protocols, we were all good. If they didn't have have it in, then I had to go back and take corrective action to make sure that they did. I've always taken more of a Department of Agriculture stance of I'm here to help my clients, help the businesses conform to what the regs are, rather than a stance a lot of my fellow auditors would take of I am the laboratory cop, you're doing something wrong, and I'm here to catch you. So I always found working with them was better than trying to seek out something they were doing, because most of the mistakes I ever saw were not intentional. They were simply a matter of not knowing what North Carolina's laws and compliance was.
Mm-hmm. So, would you say like learning more about people and getting to know them better is what you gained from all that exposure?
I would say learning how to deal with people in conflict,
Hmm.
because a lot of times I was dealing with a lot of conflict going on, and that they were very hostile because you're talking about upsetting their flow and their way of doing things. And you had to be able to explain and get them around and really negotiate or lobby, if you will, them around to your position and bring them into a knowledge of why it is important to do it the way that we're saying to do it. So that would be the people skill I would say that came the best.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now you are with Bowen and Associates.
Right.
So since I've seen like you got an illustrious career being the president there. So how about we chop it up into maybe 2 decades, or like, first decade and then maybe the next 6 years. So can you just talk us through, what kind of exposure, or what was your first few years of learning, once you jumped in with both your feet in, what was it that you probably came to realization that, okay, you didn't expect that?
Sure. I would tell you that in the beginning, I went to work for my dad. And so you had about the first half or 6 years where he was always around. But in that time, you're talking about a time that was dominated by Democrats in the North Carolina House and the Senate. And so you were dealing with, my father was probably, it was argued that he was one of the top 2 or 3 lobbyists every single year, year in, year out, but we didn't have 400 lobbyists back then either. So it was a very, very different atmosphere. And so in the beginning, I had a lot of, Fred, can you go tell your dad this, or make sure your dad knows that, and working with things. And so there wasn't a whole lot of independent operation there. I was the one that always made sure that my Republican friends were taken care of. There were a number of times early in my career where we would be talking about PAC list, and my father would not give hardly any money to Republicans whatsoever. And I would go in with a list of my Republican friends and say, okay, we need to give money to these campaigns for these particular Democrats. And he would hem and haw, and eventually he would give me my way. I would get money for those Republicans. But that was a large part of my learning process, was learning, the process and learning the procedures. And so during the beginning years, I found myself trying to lobby for a lot of extras for my Republican friends and learning the procedures at the building and that kind of thing. I find it very ironic, and my dad's rolling over in his grave today, because now I tell my clients they have to give money to Democrats. I have always believed there are 170 members in the North Carolina House and the North Carolina Senate, 120 in the House, 150 in the Senate. Each one of them is very, very important. I don't care which side of the political spectrum they're on. And that's kind of, I guess, the matured view that I've had. But I had that view even back then, in that your friend's going to be your friends, but when things change, you need to have both sides of the aisle covered, especially if you're going to adequately represent your clients. That's a very difficult thing for a lot of lobbyists in our polarized society today, because they don't want to cater it all to the other side. I've always been that way. So in the beginning part of my career, I kind of worked that by learning the process, learning the procedures, but trying to develop a relationship with all of the members at that time. Some of those members are still around today, and they're on the opposite side, and they're more in leadership. So it does pay off in the long run. So in the beginning, it was a lot of learning and following your father's shadow. Now, when Dad passed away, I actually spoke at his funeral. I was the 4th speaker at that funeral. I spoke behind Gus Tullis, who was a former member of the North Carolina Board of Transportation. He sold John Deere tractors. My dad sold Internationals. You would think that they would be rivals, but they were best of friends. I spoke behind Congressman Bob Etheridge, longstanding congressman from North Carolina and Democrat. I spoke behind then Governor Beverly Perdue, and I had to speak last in that particular order. So that was a true education in and of itself, to a crowd of probably 500 or 600 at a funeral.
Yeah.
So I did have that opportunity, and that would kind of be the turning point in the career. During the first days, we had a lot of larger clients. We represented Lorillard Tobacco, so I was on the side of Big Tobacco and Big Pharma. We represented Eli Lilly and Boehringer Ingelheim. So I've had the opportunity to represent large large interests. We've always been a boutique kind of firm. So, we kept our staff small so that we could give individual attention to our clients. And that's one of the things that I pride myself on today, is being able to look after our clients' needs. And so a lot of my first years were learning what the people are, learning the process, and learning about transitions and how you needed to go from one issue to the next and not take it personal, and dealing with large issues like smoking and pharmaceuticals. So it was very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, if you wanted to get into the second half, things changed a little bit after Dad died, but one of the things that changed was the Republicans took over in 2010. And so some of the larger clients wanted to make changes. I went to each of my clients on the day that, or a few days after Roger passed away, and asked them, hey, I'd love to have you stay with me, but I know your contract was with him. Can we work something out? Most of my clients did stay. And most of those clients I still have on my list today. I'm very client focused, very much about keeping the clients that I've had for a long time. I've become like family. I've watched their kids grow up. And so most of the clients have remained, but I have a little bit smaller clients today, a lot of associations and dealing with a lot of different people. And the issues haven't changed at all. But you'd have had a change in the people. Many of your associations, I've watched the older people hand things off to their sons and grandsons. And so that's been a thrill to be able to watch the transition between how people go forward. And in the second half, now I deal, like I said, a lot of association work, and we're in a totally different world. My father would not recognize the General Assembly today, not because the Republicans are in control, but because there is so much more polar divisiveness. Back when I began, yes, Democrats were in control, but they were more of your rural Democrats. They were farmers and agribusinessmen. The Agriculture Committee was the king committee that everybody wanted to be on. But due to population shifts and other things, now you're more interested in commerce and the rules committee and those things than you are the agriculture committee, because agriculture doesn't play the dominant role that it did 16 years ago. We've just changed as a state. We've had a lot of influx of new people. And so it doesn't play the same role. And so those things have all changed. And you have to be able to change with them. You can't lobby the same way that you did 16 years ago today, because people have Zoom and they have Facebook, and people are hired today on whether or not you can do Facebook and internet skills and those kinds of things. Whereas before, most of the legislative assistants were somebody's wife who needed a part-time job. Now we've got people who actually have their PhDs doing legislative assistant work. So things have changed a lot in 16 years here in North Carolina. We have become much more like Washington, D.C., much larger staffs. Compared today, I think the Speaker's staff has either 7 or 8 people full-time. Back when my father served on Liston Ramsey's staff in the 1980s, there were 3. There was him, Jim Long, and they may have had one other person. Roger was basically the chief of staff. Jim Long was the lawyer, and that was it. So you didn't have these staffs are 2 or 3 times what they used to be. So lots of things have changed, and I don't think he'd recognize where we are today, but I will tell you that it's a different world. And one person asked me, and I think that this is a pretty good story. He told me, he said, his name was Jim Jackman. He was a senator. And when the Senate was taken over by the Republicans, he comes up to me and he says, hey, Fred, you've been around a spell. Can you tell me what you think about the Republicans taking over the Senate? And I looked at him, and Senator Jackman was a very giving man, and I thought the world of him. And he always made ice cream every spring that he served. He put a John Deere ice cream machine like at the state fair out between the 2 buildings. He made ice cream for everybody, and it was straight out of his pocket. And I said, Senator Jackman, you know how you made ice cream for everybody? He said, well, yeah. I said, that would make chocolate or make vanilla or it make strawberry, wouldn't it? He said, well, yeah. I said, I could run that machine, you could run that machine, or Booker over there could run that machine. And he says, well, yeah, but what's that got to do with my question about the Republicans taking over in the Senate? And I said, it's got everything to do, Senator. This place is just like your ice cream machine. It'll make a different flavor and a different person's running it, but the machine works the way the machine works. And that is the truth. Yeah. That's the only thing that's the same between now and 16 years ago is don't really care who's in power or what flavor of ice cream we're making. The machine still works the way the machine works. We
Yeah.
can try to open meetings or we can try to do these other things, but it all boils down to about 15 to 20 in a room behind closed doors to make final decisions that everybody else is going to go along with.
Yes, very true, very true. And along this journey of yours, have you had any specific policies or challenging projects which you can particularly remember?
Oh, there are a lot of projects that we've had along the way. One of the biggest ones that I think that I had to fight was I had a former majority leader, Hugh Holloman, and Hugh was determined that we were going to ban smoking in restaurants. Well, didn't happen for a number of years because I represented tobacco, and I would go on the floor and one particular vote, Hugh just knew he was going to get it out of the House. I counted, I knew that Hugh didn't have the votes. And sure enough, when we voted on it, Hugh didn't have the votes. So I was able to keep smoking out of restaurants for a number of years. Wasn't that and a lot of times in lobbying, it's a matter of figuring out what's important in law. It's not important that we ban smoking in all restaurants. The important thing is that a business should have the right to cater to the person that they want to cater to that fits their business model. If that happens to be smokers, which tend to sit around, smoke a cigarette, need an extra piece of pie, or smoke an extra cigarette, then a business ought to have the right to cater to that person and not have government tell you, no, you cannot do this, you must do just like everybody else. And so it was a business argument. Many businesses spend upwards of $100,000 or more for filtration system, and why should they not be able to cater to the clientele that they wanted to? So I worked on that issue for a number of years. I personally am glad I don't have to go into a restaurant where people are still smoking today, but I still regret that businesses did eventually get put into where you can't smoke anywhere. I'm glad that we're where we are, but I do still think businesses should have a choice. And so that's one of the issues that I've worked. I've been very proud to represent the North Carolina Firemen's Association, the North Carolina Association of Rescue and EMS. I've done a lot of different projects for fire and EMS communities all over the state. I've helped with a lot of different things for my rescue brothers and sisters, and I really appreciate the opportunity to recognize our first responders across the state. I'm really proud of the work I've done for them. A lot of work in their pension program. It's behind the scenes kind of things, but getting a little bit every year, increase in the pension makes a difference to these volunteers across our state. Modern issue that I'm working on with them is just trying to keep parity, and they like things like being a part of the Wildlife Resources Program on having a statewide hunting and fishing license discount for volunteers. So it's always good to have that white hat account where you can look after your EMS and your other workers. And anytime you talk about one client, you get off on all of your clients because all of them are important. But those are some of the things that I've had the opportunity to do that I've really enjoyed. I enjoy working with those groups.
Interesting. And how do you usually get your clients?
That is the million-dollar question for anybody going into the lobbying world. It truly is. And I hate to say it, but it is all word of mouth. So many of them are ones that I've had forever. I have not found a marketing campaign. I have not found a direct mail campaign that works. I have tried everything. I've tried the websites. I'm always open to new clients, but most often is when they say that so-and-so has called and recommended you. We would like to talk to you about representing our business. For instance, I had a long-term friend and lawyer call me just the other week saying, Fred, I don't know if you know him or not, but this group had their lobbyist pass away last year. And I said, yes, I knew him, but vaguely. Would you be willing to sit down and talk to them about their needs in the legislature? And I said, I would be more than happy to. And 2 days later, I find myself in the car driving to Mount Pleasant, North Carolina, and I now represent the North Carolina Association of Gamefowl Breeders Association, I believe is the proper thing. So I find myself representing chickens because I got a phone call from a friend. And I'm glad to do that and help anybody that I can. But most often it comes from a referral, either from, they'll ask a legislator, and they're not supposed to give referrals, but a lot of times they'll say, hey, I know this and this guy and this guy is a great lobbyist, and I'll pass a name on. I was one time with a rules chair who had a group from his home district touring the legislature. And he sees me walking across the room, and he says, Fred, come over here for a minute. And I said, yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. And he says, I want you to meet my school group from such and such a school. And I said, it's a pleasure to meet you. And he looks at them and he says, let me tell you something. This is Fred Bone. He's one of the finest lobbyists around here. And here's why. He said, when Fred comes to my office, he tells me what his clients want, what they need. But what's more, he tells me what the other side's going to say as well. And that's what makes a good lobbyist. So I've always taken that word of mouth and taken that as a high compliment. But many times it is just a matter of referrals and networking.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like at any point in your career that politics took a front seat to policy?
Oh, I would tell you yes. I would not lie to you and tell you no. I do believe that, and I'll give you a real good illustration of it. I was in committee one time. We were representing cancer patients, and it was right here in Raleigh, and there was a machine called a linear accelerator that was not part of the Certificate of Need program when this particular group of doctors established a cancer center. And so I go into committee, and we were thinking that everything was good. We had this group of doctors, and it was all about patient care, all about caring for the patients on one floor, having somebody meet them at their car with a wheelchair, bring them in. They would be able to get their chemo or this linear accelerator radiation that they needed. Everything was on one floor. It was focused around the family. It was focused around the person and the person who was suffering. When we got to committee, all of a sudden, our bill got totally railroaded. We got run off the rails by former Senator Tony Rand. He passed away recently, so I probably can tell the story now that he's gone. But we got totally derailed, and I did not understand that. Went back to the office, and I talked to my father about it, and I said, how come when we're on the side of the angels here that our bill got totally tracked out and dismissed and never came up again, really? And he looked at me, he said, Fred, you got to understand. He says, sometimes you do what's right, and sometimes it's just not going to work out for other reasons. And it was totally political. A group of doctors who were very close with Tony Rand didn't want there to be any more competition, and there wasn't any more competition. I did see the good senator, and you'll always hear Tony Rand stories. My favorite was not long after that. I said, hey, Senator, great to see you in committee. I appreciate you. And I sure hate I couldn't get my little bill. And he looked at me and he says, Fred, sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. I just want to know when my turn at windshield is, Senator.
That's amazing.
I got tired of being bugged, but that's what you are as a lobbyist. Sometimes you get things that are political override what might be for what you perceive as the greater good.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I think those are the set of questions I had for you, Fred. So now I will stop asking you questions, and you have a few minutes either to talk about yourself, or you want to talk something about your future. Like, let's say, how do you see yourself in the next 5-10 years down the line? Or you want to talk about your company, that's fine too.
No problem. I will tell you that my company is myself. I'm going to be spending most of the weekend working, because when you're a small company, as you well know, it is a lot about having to get the work done when you have to. You have to make hay when the sun's shining. But I'm very happy to have the opportunity to work with the General Assembly. It's some of the finest people that you will ever meet. Doesn't matter what side you are on. It's always a fellowship, and it always has been that way. The lobbyist community tends to look after one another and try to watch over one another. I think that it's important when you go to the General Assembly that you educate members, and you do educate them on both sides of the issue. You just have to educate them on why your side's more important. So that's one thing that you always want to do. When people are looking to get in it, the first thing I tell them is you've got to be able to find clients. It goes back to your previous question. It's all about how do you find clients and people that want me to go over there and represent them. The last line of my newsletter each week is thank you for allowing me the opportunity to represent you here in Raleigh, because in total, I probably represent more people through associations and businesses than most legislators, because I'm representing their specific issues. The 28,000 volunteer EMS people from around the state depend on me to keep them apprised of what's happening in Raleigh. All the other businesses that I represent and the employees that work for them depend on their lobbyists to keep things that could adversely affect their business to keep their jobs. And so it's an important job that I have. When talking with a legislator, and a lot of freshman legislators will recognize that I've been around as long as most of the stools in the building, they will say, Fred, what's the one thing you would tell me as a legislator, having not served yourself, but being around for so long? And I always tell them the same thing. That is, that it's not personal. The bill that you're against on one day or 1 hour or 1 minute even, you will be my worst enemy and think that I have a pitchfork and tail. But on the very next bill, I may be your best friend in the whole world. And don't make it personal. Just because I represent something you don't like on one issue, don't hold that against the lobbyist, because I'm the messenger. But that's where lawyers have the advantage at the General Assembly. They can separate one case from another. They can fight like devils all day long in the courthouse, and then they go have a beer with their friends afterwards. That's what a good legislator does. They'll fight like the devil with you and be against you on something they're opposed to that they think they're doing for their constituents. But at the same time, they'll go hang out with you and your friends afterwards. The legislators that hold a grudge tend to be the ones that aren't there as long. And they give themselves an ulcer in the process. So my advice is always, it's not personal. It may seem personal, and the attacks these days seem a lot more personal, but it's not personal. As far as my business, I try to be a boutique firm. I try to give my clients individual attention. I try to make sure that their needs are addressed. And sometimes I have to show them why the other side is saying what they're saying so that we can modify our goals and objectives so that we all walk out at least holding hands. I tend to see myself as a problem solver that likes to deal with difficult situations. I'm also a salesman. If you want to talk about lobbying, what is lobbying? You're doing nothing but selling ideas. You're an educator and a salesman. That's all you are. And anybody can do it if they're willing to put the time and effort into being that salesman and learning the material you got to learn to be able to go and educate people. But that's really what we do. I really appreciate your time today and the opportunity to talk about myself in business. If there's anything that you need to know, I'm here for you and always happy to help.
Well, thank you so much, Fred, again, for being on the show. Lovely talking to you.
And great talking to you too.
Right.
All right.
That was a fun conversation with Fred, learning about his journey into advocacy. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening and for your support. Until next time, take care.